Hi everyone, I'm Lorraine Driscoll, and this is another episode of Building Better Brains, where each week I talk about the root causes of why your child might be struggling with learning, reading, and behavior, and what are some of the solutions that reach way beyond IEPs, medication, and endless tutoring. So today I want to talk about multiple diagnosis and all that overlap, because it's something that happens way more often than people realize, and unfortunately it's something that a lot of moms have a lot of shame and guilt about, and feel like they've just been, struck by lightning multiple times. So what often happens is that parents or moms come in with their children for one thing. It's, the one that's kind of making them pull their hair out or that has them up at night worrying, like, they can't read, they're really falling behind with their learning, or they're having major behavior issues both at home and at school. And there's often a lot going on when this happens. And, it's a lot more, well, first of all, when parents come into my office, they talk about that one thing, and then we find out that there is maybe dyspraxia going on along with the dyslexia or dysgraphia. Or they might tell me that, he has ADHD, but there's a lot of sensory processing issues going on. And throw all of that in, and then often, as we start digging deeper, that's when I often find out that there's maybe some psoriasis, some eczema, asthma, seasonal allergies, food allergies, all kinds of immune issues. Could be immune, like their child is always sick, or immune, their child is never sick, meaning their child is in hyper, their immune system's in hyper alert, and everyone else in the house gets sick. Their child doesn't get sick, but their behavior or their struggles, whether that's with sensory processing or even learning, tends to get worse. So these moms, often feel very discouraged and guilty. Moms, that's what we do by nature. And whenever your child has not just one diagnosis, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 diagnoses, there's often a lot of shame there, and a lot of shame and guilt for the children as well. And it can also feel very overwhelming and discouraging, because these diagnoses can feel like you have so much work to do, that you have to deal with the dyslexia and the dyscalculia and the ADHD, and then there's the sensory processing, and before you know it, you're running to 10 different appointments, and you have all of these different protocols that you've got to implement. And what a lot of people don't realize is that all of these disorders are all related to the same problem. And it's really common, for example, I frequently see children in my office who have dyslexia, dyspraxia, and ADHD, or dyslexia, dysgraphia, and sensory processing issues. And this is all proof that something is really, really off in the brain. There's some, first of all, often nutrient deficiencies, and it doesn't mean that you're a bad mom and you're feeding your child a horrible diet. But there's some often deficiencies because of possibly genetic reasons, or their body's not able to absorb nutrients for all kinds of reasons that I'm not going to get into right now. And that there's brain disorganization, that the brain structure and wiring is disorganized and weak, and that's going to cause a whole lot of breakdown with a whole lot of things. And then that's why you have all of these multiple diagnoses. And I find this incredibly hopeful when I see these multiple diagnoses, because it's proof that this can be changed. And I guess proof because we know that the brain is extremely plastic, and there's a ton we can do with nutrition. And I know that because I also see it every day in clinic. So just to make you feel better, if your child has received multiple diagnoses, or if you suspect that, multiple diagnosis is so much the rule with childhood disorders, including things like dyslexia and ADHD, that it is not the exception, it's the rule. And it's so much the rule that it's regularly researched as to why this is happening. And as crazy as this might sound, my favorite clients are the ones who have multiple diagnoses. And the reason for that is that's where we see the greatest change the most quickly. And I definitely see results with single diagnoses as well, but when there's so much going on, it means there's just almost such a mess right now going on that you just make one positive change or a few positive changes, and parents really start to see results, and that really builds momentum to keep going on this kind of trajectory. So to give you an idea of multiple diagnosis, and in terms of statistics and so forth, 50% of children with dyslexia also have ADHD. And 60% of children with dyspraxia also, or with dyslexia, also have dyspraxia, and 17% of children with dyslexia have ODD. And I could go on and on and on about the link with the stats and the overlap and so forth. So it really goes to show that you're not alone, you didn't do something horrible, you're not a horrible mom, and so forth. And these multiple diagnoses can pop up and show up like things like picky eating, as you know, difficulty with reading and focusing, poor penmanship or illegible penmanship, clumsiness, aggression, attitude, the list goes on and on. And these are all signs that your child's brain is really struggling, that there's some area of disconnect and possibly even malnourishment. And so the overlap really boils down to weak connections, disconnection, and imbalance in the brain. And so if you're feeling guilty about all of that, consider that a lot has changed in the last 30 years. A ton has changed in terms of how we develop, in terms of how we raise our children, how we nourish our children. If we even look at our food supply, everything from how our food is grown, to the soil it's grown in, to the way it's manufactured, to the way it is shipped, to the way it's packaged, to the way it's processed. You know, most of the food we go to birthday parties and everything else is not real food, if you will. You know, there's a lot of changes to lifestyle. We have our children in these baby carriers. I did it too. You know, I'm not trying to guilt anybody. I had my daughter in, you know, the saucers and the swings and all of that type of stuff, and she really didn't get enough sensory motor development because I didn't know enough at that time about the importance of floor time and tummy time and how that is what develops the lower brain levels. So, you know, this isn't, it's not you, it's us. We've changed as a culture and as a species in terms of how we evolved. So if you're wondering what a weak connection is in the brain, that basically is an area of underdevelopment where there's the difference between a child who learns well and a child who struggles is the child who learns well has lots of connections and in the right places. And the child who has difficulty does not have enough connections, or they might have a lot of connections in an area of genius in a certain area of their brain, but they don't have enough connections in all of the areas. They're not what's called a whole brain child or whole brain learner. And that can totally change, or we can change that with different therapies. And often basically what's happening is that the child is not using the best part of their brain to perform a specific task. So for example, with dyslexia, these children are reading from the right side of the brain, which is what sees, the right side of the brain is like the big picture, sees everything as a whole. The left side of the brain is very sequential. And that part of the brain is where the language center is, and they're not using that side of the brain to read. So it's kind of like, the description I give is that it's kind of like using your foot to open the door instead of your hand, because for whatever reason your hand is not, you're not able to use your hand. So you're probably going to be able to do the job, but it's going to be hard, and you're probably not going to do a very good job at opening it. And that's could be what's happening with why your child is having such a hard time reading, why they're having such a hard time learning, or why they're having such a hard time focusing and sitting still, or, you know, staying calm, or whatever the case may be. And in terms of brain development and the lower brain levels, the way I explain that is it would be like the doctor who's highly trained shows up to work one day, the secretary who does a very good job at what she does, she's not as highly trained as the doctor, isn't really doing her job, so the doctor now has to do the secretary's job. And what's going to be the result of that is he can't do his job very well because she's doing her job. And that's basically what's happening in the brain. And so basically in terms of the overlap, the same areas involved for reading, focus, behavior, self-regulation, you know, sensory motor control, all of that are all being affected. So then you're going to have very frequently multiple diagnoses. And so if there are weak connections in the brain, that basically means the brain is working too hard to learn or too hard in order to self-regulate and manage their behavior. And what that can look like is basically, as I mentioned, disconnect. So there's not strong connections in certain areas of the brain, or even that there's one area of the brain, like the right side of the brain with dyslexia, which is why we often see children who have dyslexia, they're really strong in art very often, and more creative skills. because the right side of the brain is responsible for that, and then the left side is not as developed. So if we can strengthen that left side of the brain and get that side of the brain reading, then they can still keep their gifts, and they can also not struggle as much with those other processes. And what's basically also happening with this overlap is these diagnoses are being based on a cluster of symptoms rather than, the underlying source of the problem. So, for example, if you have poor phonemic awareness with, possibly weak auditory processing and poor working memory, then you're most likely going to have a child who's going to be diagnosed with some kind of reading disorder like dyslexia. However, if they have still weak auditory processing, but now their executive function is seen to be weak on the psycho-ed evaluation, then they're going to have a diagnosis of ADHD, and that might be on top of the dyslexia. So I don't want to knock diagnoses, they're very real disorders, and getting them can provide a lot of answers and help to clarify things and give you a starting point. But basically what they all boil down to is areas of underdevelopment and kind of areas of the brain that are short circuits, that are kind of have short circuits. And I was just talking to a mom today who has a daughter who's very discouraged. She's in grade 5 and just found out on top of dyslexia and dyspraxia, she also, and some ADHD tendencies, she also has a diagnosis of dyscalculia. And what that basically means is, she's feeling very discouraged and very down on herself. And I said to the mom, just explain to her that it's like an electrician who really shouldn't have gotten his license has done the wiring, and the wiring is doing an okay job, but it's not optimal. And so the result is your daughter's having to work a lot harder, and despite all her hard work, it's still not going to be an optimal job. So if we can change those pathways and those connections and get a better electrician in, then things will work much more smoothly. So it was Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, the kind of pioneer of the gut-brain connection, as well as the GAPS diet, the gut and psychology syndrome, who first noted the overlap of these disorders when she was working with children in her office. And she noted not only that there was overlap of the disorders, but also overlap with the gut health and immune issues, that these kids were often more sickly and had all these other skin conditions and so forth. So she was basically the pioneer in the brain-gut connection, and that is a piece of the puzzle, but definitely not the only piece in the puzzle. And I think to varying degrees, we all understand to some extent the importance of brain health, and how much that can impact in the biochemistry and how that can influence our mood and self-regulation, and nourishment is so important. But what we don't hear enough about, and which just blows my mind the more I learn about it, is the importance of good brain organization. If the brain is disorganized, that is going to impact so much, and it's going to result in diagnoses like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, sensory processing, OCD, ODD, ADHD, all of those acronyms that we're seeing, so much now in children. And that kind of brings me to the next topic, if you will, or leading into the one issue with psycho-ed evaluations is they will tell you things like your child has weak auditory processing, or their executive functioning or phonemic awareness is compromised. And that's great. It tells us what's underneath the disorder itself. And those processes, like executive function or auditory processing, affects multiple skills like focus and following instructions, memory, reading, all that type of stuff. But they do not tell us why the auditory processing is weak. And it also does not tell us how to strengthen those areas. We don't have to just modify on an IEP, right? IEPs are helpful if they're helping us to get to a goal to improve a skill, not just to kind of water something down, till forever, so to speak. So the focus should be on strengthening the weak connections, on improving the brain development, addressing those areas of underdevelopment. We can do that even into the 40s and 50s. That's been researched. And of course, nutritional therapy, because if the brain is not getting the nutrients it needs, then obviously it can't make the connections despite all of the therapies and brain integration therapies that we do. And so that is really the core of trying to improve or even overcome learning and behavior disorders rather than simply managing them. So don't blame yourself if your child has multiple diagnoses, and do not feel alone, do not feel ashamed, because it's the rule, not the exception. So if you found this information helpful, please share. And if you want to learn more about my programs, which combine nutritional therapy with brain integration therapy to get to the root cause and underlying issues of why your child is struggling with learning and reading and behavior, then check out my programs on my website. I'll post the link in the comments below. Thanks for watching.